It was early morning when Daniel Rivers opened his eyes and felt that soft, familiar quiet inside his small apartment, the kind of quiet that feels like a soft blanket on the mind. And as he lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, he felt something a little strange, like a small weight pressing on his chest, not heavy enough to stop him from moving, but just heavy enough to make him wonder why life felt slightly harder than it needed to be. And in this calm silence, he thought about all the conversations he had yesterday, the ones that felt flat, the ones that ended too quickly, the ones where he wanted to say something, but the words didn't come out the way he hoped, and he remembered the moment his friend asked him if he was okay. And he smiled and said yes, even though it wasn't true, even though he felt confused inside, even though he felt something closing quietly around his heart like a soft door. And when he thought about that moment, he knew something was missing in the way he communicated with people, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't really understand his own feelings, and maybe that was why he couldn't understand the feelings of others either. So he sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes, and told himself that maybe today could be different. Maybe today he could learn something new, something that could help him talk to people in a more open, more honest, more human way. And as he got out of bed, he felt that small spark of curiosity inside him, like a candle in a dark room, and he didn't know it yet, but this would be the spark that would lead him into one of the deepest learning journeys of his life, a journey into emotional intelligence. And you are listening to this story on Mr. English Lab. And as I speak slowly with you and guide you through Daniel's path, you can imagine everything clearly, practice listening naturally, and feel yourself growing in your English, step by step, moment by moment, as if you were walking beside Daniel on this long and gentle road. As Daniel moved through his small apartment making coffee, he felt that something inside him was pushing him, almost whispering, telling him to pay attention to his emotions instead of ignoring them. And while he waited for the hot water to boil, he thought about all the times he stayed silent when he should have spoken, all the times he spoke quickly when he should have slowed down, all the times he felt misunderstood, which only made him pull away from people even more. And he felt a small ache in his chest as he remembered an argument he'd had with a coworker 2 weeks ago, an argument that still bothered him in the quiet moments of the night, because he had raised his voice without knowing why. And the more he tried to explain himself, the more confused he felt, and later when he replayed that moment in his mind, he realized that he wasn't angry at the coworker at all. He had been frustrated with himself, frustrated with his own lack of clarity, frustrated with how his emotions were loud inside but quiet on the outside. And as he stood there sipping his warm coffee, he whispered to himself, "I want to understand people better. I want to understand myself better." And even though no one else could hear him, those words created the first small step in his long journey toward emotional intelligence. It was a simple morning, the kind of morning that appears in every life without warning, the kind where nothing special seems to happen, but something meaningful begins inside you anyway. And Daniel felt it in the soft air, in the slow rhythm of his breathing, and in the gentle desire to improve. And he decided to take a long walk through the city park near his home, because sometimes the mind thinks better when the body moves. And as he walked under the tall green trees, he felt the world open around him like a giant, quiet classroom. And he knew that this walk was not just a walk, it was the beginning of a long conversation with himself, a conversation he had been avoiding for many years, and each step felt like a small question. Why do I get upset so fast? Why do I hide my feelings? Why do I find it so hard to understand what other people feel? Why do some conversations go wrong when all I want is to connect? These questions floated through his mind like soft clouds in the morning sky, and even though they felt heavy, they also felt important, and for the first time Daniel allowed himself to hold them gently instead of pushing them away. As he reached the center of the park, he sat on a wooden bench and watched the quiet movement of people, an old couple walking slowly, a mother pushing a stroller, a man feeding pigeons near the fountain, and he felt something warm inside his chest. Something like understanding, because for the first time he realized that every person carries invisible stories, invisible feelings, invisible struggles, and maybe he didn't communicate well because he didn't take enough time to see those invisible things in others, and maybe he didn't see them because he had never taken the time to see those things in himself, and this simple realization felt like the first soft doorway opening in his mind. A doorway that led into a deeper understanding of human emotions, and he whispered again to himself, "I want to learn," and the words floated into the morning air like small promises. While he sat there, Daniel remembered a moment from his childhood, a moment he had forgotten for many years, when he was about 8 years old, and he was trying to tell his parents how he felt after losing a school competition. But the words didn't come out the way he wanted, so he stayed silent instead, and when his father asked, "Are you okay?" he nodded even though his chest was hurting with disappointment, and that moment stayed inside him for years, shaping the way he expressed emotions, teaching him that silence was easier than vulnerability. And as he remembered that moment on the park bench, he felt something heavy and warm in his throat, like a soft sadness, but also a soft understanding. Because he realized that many adults carry emotional habits that began in childhood, and maybe learning emotional intelligence wasn't about fixing himself, but about understanding himself, and this thought brought him a small feeling of peace. The wind moved gently through the trees, and Daniel breathed in slowly as he watched the sunlight dance on the leaves, and he thought about how emotions are like weather. They come, they change, they pass, they return, and just like weather, they need understanding, not fear. And he realized that he had spent years ignoring his emotions like someone closing the curtains during a storm instead of learning how to sit and watch the sky. And as he sat on that bench, he finally opened the curtains inside his mind and allowed himself to feel everything: curiosity, confusion, hope, sadness, excitement, and a quiet desire for transformation. After a few minutes, Daniel took out a small notebook from his bag, one he usually used for work notes, but today he opened it for something different, something more personal, and he wrote slowly, "What do I feel right now?" And he waited for the answer. Breathing, listening, thinking, letting the emotions move naturally, and the words that came to him were simple but honest. "I feel unsure. I feel hopeful. I feel ready." And as he wrote them, he felt a soft release inside, like a tiny knot loosening in his chest, and he smiled softly, because writing the truth made him feel lighter, clearer, more honest with himself. And maybe this simple practice could help him develop emotional intelligence step by step, moment by moment, one small sentence at a time. While he continued to walk through the park, Daniel thought about how emotional intelligence wasn't something people were born with, it was something people learned. Just like language, just like communication, just like understanding. And he felt encouraged by this thought, because it meant he wasn't broken or behind. He was simply learning, growing, stretching, becoming something stronger and softer at the same time, and as he walked he imagined himself in the future, someone who could listen deeply, someone who could speak gently, someone who could understand people without judging them, someone who could move through conversations with calmness instead of fear, and this picture made him smile in a way he hadn't smiled in a long time. As the morning turned slowly into noon, Daniel left the park and walked toward a small cafe he liked, a quiet place with warm lights and soft music, and he sat at a table by the window, watching the world outside as he drank a cup of tea. And as he sat there he noticed the people around him more carefully than he usually did, the tired student reading a book, the man talking softly on the phone, the woman at the counter speaking warmly to the barista. And he realized that emotional intelligence begins with awareness, with noticing, with slowing down enough to see the details of people's faces, the tone of their voice, the shape of their emotions, and as he watched these simple moments, Daniel felt himself opening slowly, like a flower learning how to bloom after a long winter. Then, quietly, something unexpected happened. The woman at the table next to him dropped her phone, and it fell to the floor with a loud sound, startling her, and Daniel instinctively looked over, and instead of just giving a quick polite smile like he usually did, he said softly, "Are you okay?" And she looked up, surprised but grateful, and she smiled at him, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, and she said, "Yes, thank you. I'm just a little distracted today," and Daniel nodded, and for a moment they shared a small but warm human connection, and he felt something inside him shift, something small but meaningful. And he realized that emotional intelligence wasn't always about big conversations or deep moments. It could also be found in tiny interactions, in small kindnesses, in gentle words, in simple presence. This tiny moment stayed with him even after he left the cafe, because it made him feel the truth of something he had always heard but never understood deeply. That connection begins with awareness, and awareness begins with attention. And attention begins with slowing down long enough to notice the emotions around you and inside you. And as he walked home through the quiet afternoon streets, Daniel felt his heart beating peacefully with a new kind of rhythm, the rhythm of a person beginning a long journey toward emotional intelligence, not because he had all the answers, but because he was finally ready to ask the right questions. When he reached his apartment, he took a deep breath and looked around the quiet room, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt less heavy, less lonely, more like a friendly space where he could grow and learn. And he sat at his small desk and opened his notebook again, writing slowly, "Today, I began," and those 3 simple words made him feel proud, calm, and open, and as he closed his eyes for a moment, he felt the gentle beginning of transformation inside him. A transformation that would take time, patience, courage, and honesty, and as the afternoon sunlight filled the room, Daniel whispered to himself, "I can learn this. I can change," and the whisper felt like the soft beginning of a promise to himself. And as our section 1 ends, you can feel this moment like the first step in a long path, a path that will lead Daniel deeper into the world of emotions, communication, truth, and human connection. And as you listen to this story through Mr. English Lab, you are not only following Daniel's journey, you are learning how to understand yourself too. The next morning arrived with a soft gray sky hanging over the city, and as Daniel woke up, he felt something inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time, something like quiet motivation, the kind that rises gently in the chest and whispers, "Keep going." And as he walked to the kitchen to make breakfast, he noticed that the world around him felt slightly different, not because the world had changed, but because he had changed a little on the inside, becoming a little more open, a little more aware. And while he fried 2 eggs in a small pan, he thought about his walk through the park yesterday, the moment with the woman in the cafe, the calm feeling of writing his emotions on paper, and the simple recognition that he wanted to learn emotional intelligence, not to impress people, not to become perfect, but to understand himself and others more honestly. And this thought gave him a feeling of purpose, a feeling he had been missing for years without even knowing it. As he sat down at his table to eat, he opened his notebook and wrote 1 sentence at the top of the page. "Today, I will train my emotional awareness." And even though it sounded simple, it felt powerful, like a personal promise. like the first page of a new chapter in his life, and as he finished his breakfast, he stood up slowly and decided that he would spend this day exploring his emotions with intention, curiosity, and kindness toward himself. After cleaning up, Daniel put on his jacket and walked outside into the cool morning air, the kind of air that wakes you up gently, and he walked toward the same park where he had been the day before, because something about that place helped him think, helped him feel, helped him breathe more deeply. And as he walked, he paid attention to small things he usually ignored: the sound of leaves sliding against each other in the breeze, the distant sound of a dog barking, the soft rhythm of his own footsteps on the sidewalk, and he realized that emotional intelligence begins with noticing, and noticing begins with slowing down, and slowing down begins with a choice. The choice to be present in the moment instead of rushing through life like a person running late for something they don't understand. When he arrived at the park, he found an empty bench near the fountain and sat down, listening to the soft splash of water as it rose and fell, and he took a slow breath, the kind that fills the lungs gently, not aggressively, and he asked himself a simple question: what am I feeling right now? And at first, the answer didn't come, because his mind moved too fast, jumping from one thought to another like a restless bird. But he waited, breathing slowly, letting his emotions rise naturally, and finally he said quietly to himself, I feel nervous. I feel excited. I feel hopeful. And as he said those words aloud in a soft whisper, he felt something warm spreading across his chest, not heat, not pressure, but clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when a feeling is named and no longer trapped inside the shadows of the mind. While he sat on that bench, Daniel remembered something he had read once about emotions, that when you name a feeling, it loses some of its power to control you and becomes something you can understand, like a small light turning on in a dark room. And he realized that for many years he had let his emotions control his reactions, letting frustration turn into anger, letting confusion turn into silence, letting sadness turn into withdrawal, because he didn't know how to slow down and see what the emotion really was, and this realization made him feel slightly sad but also relieved, because now he knew that change was possible. A few minutes later, Daniel noticed a young father walking by with a little girl who looked about 4 years old, and she was crying softly, not loudly, but in that quiet, tired way children sometimes cry when they feel overwhelmed. And the father gently knelt in front of her and said in a soft voice, I know you're upset. Can you tell me why? And the little girl sniffed and pointed toward a balloon floating away high above the trees, and the father didn't laugh or ignore her. He simply nodded and said, It's okay to feel sad. I'm here with you. And he picked her up and hugged her, and Daniel watched this simple moment with deep interest, because he realized that emotional intelligence begins in childhood, and that girl was learning something powerful, that her emotions mattered, that they were allowed, that they could be named and understood. And he thought about how different life might have been if he had learned those lessons when he was young. But instead of feeling regret, he felt a calm determination to learn those lessons now. After sitting for a long time, Daniel stood up and began walking around the park again, and this time he paid attention not only to his own emotions, but to the emotions on the faces of others, and he noticed small things he would normally overlook. The tired but proud smile of an elderly man feeding ducks, the frustrated frown of a teenager staring at his phone, the joyful laughter of a group of friends sitting on a blanket, and he realized that emotional intelligence was not only an inner journey, it was also a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding the invisible stories people carry, the silent storms they hide, the small joys they protect, and the more he walked, the more he felt a growing sense of empathy. a feeling that connected him to these strangers through a thin, invisible thread of shared humanity. And while he walked, he whispered softly to himself, "Everyone feels something. Everyone struggles. Everyone hopes," and these simple words made the world feel bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger because it was full of different lives, smaller because all those lives carried the same basic emotions. As the morning turned into early afternoon, Daniel felt hungry and returned to the cafe he had visited the day before, and as he entered, he felt a gentle confidence inside him, not loud, not bright, but warm and steady. And he ordered a sandwich and sat at the same table by the window. This time, instead of watching people passively, he tried something new. He practiced reading emotions on people's faces, noting the relaxed shoulders of a man who had just finished a phone call, the worried eyebrows of a woman looking at her laptop, the joyful energy in the young couple sharing a pastry, and he didn't judge any of these people. He simply observed them with curiosity and care, and as he did, he felt his mind expanding, like a window opening to let in fresh air. While he ate his sandwich, he overheard two people talking softly at a nearby table, one of them explaining that he had failed an exam, and his friend said gently, "It's okay. Failing doesn't mean you're not smart. It just means you need more time." And Daniel felt something warm in his chest again, because he realized that emotional intelligence is often hidden in simple phrases, simple tones, simple acts of kindness that help people feel safe and understood. After finishing his meal, Daniel took out his notebook again and wrote down 2 short sentences. "I want to listen better, and I want to understand people's emotions without guessing," and as he wrote these words, he felt his motivation growing. And he knew the only way to improve was to practice, so he told himself that today he would have at least one real conversation with someone, a conversation where he listened not only to the words, but to the emotions underneath them. When he stepped outside the cafe, the sky had finally started to brighten, the gray clouds drifting away slowly, revealing patches of blue, and he walked toward a small bookstore he liked, because the owner, Mr. Hanley, was always calm and kind, and Daniel felt safe talking to him. When Daniel entered the shop, he heard the soft sound of a bell above the door, and Mr. Hanley looked up from the counter and smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Daniel," he said in his usual gentle voice, and Daniel smiled back and walked slowly to the counter. They talked for a moment about books, about the weather, about the new display near the window, and then, trying to practice emotional intelligence, Daniel asked softly, "How has your day been?" And he tried to ask the question not out of politeness, but with real interest, real presence, and when he did, he noticed something surprising. Mr. Hanley's smile changed slightly, not disappearing but softening, and he said, "It's been a little difficult, to be honest," and Daniel listened carefully, paying attention to the tone, the slight heaviness in the older man's voice. And Mr. Hanley continued, explaining that his daughter had recently moved to another city, and he missed her, and it felt strange walking into an empty house after closing the shop each evening, and as he spoke, Daniel felt something in his chest, a soft ache, a gentle empathy, and instead of offering advice or changing the subject, he said quietly, "That sounds really hard. You must miss her a lot," and when he said those words, something softened in the old man's eyes, like a small weight being lifted, and he nodded slowly and said, "Yes. Thank you for saying that," and Daniel realized that sometimes emotional intelligence means simply giving someone permission to feel, to speak, to share, and not trying to fix what cannot be fixed. After leaving the bookstore, Daniel walked home with a calm, peaceful feeling inside him, because he felt like he had done something real, something human, something gentle and honest, and that small conversation with Mr. Hanley became a quiet victory for him. A sign that he could learn, that he could change, that he could understand people in ways he never had before. When he reached his apartment, he sat at his desk again, opened his notebook, and wrote, "Listening is an act of love," and when he read those words again, he felt something inside him blossom. A soft realization that emotional intelligence is not only a skill, it is a way of caring, a way of seeing the world with softer eyes, and as he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, he felt grateful for the small steps he had taken today, steps that were slowly transforming him from the inside out. And as the evening light filled his apartment, Daniel whispered gently to himself, "I am changing. I am learning," and with that quiet truth, he felt a warmth in his heart that carried him into the calm of the night. The next day began with a soft rain tapping gently against Daniel's window, and as he lay in bed listening to the calming rhythm, he felt something unusual inside him. Something like a quiet courage mixed with a little fear, because even though he had taken small steps toward emotional intelligence, he knew there was a deeper part of the journey waiting for him, a part that wasn't about other people at all. A part he had been avoiding for many years, and as he sat up slowly in the gentle morning light, he realized that today would not be about watching other people's emotions or listening carefully to strangers. Today would be about looking inside himself, about understanding the hidden layers of his own feelings, the ones he pushed away, the ones he didn't want to see, the ones that shaped his reactions without his permission. And as he made breakfast, he felt his heart beating with a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Because self-awareness is not easy, it is not soft, it is not simple, it is a mirror that shows you not only your strengths and hopes, but also your fears, your habits, your blind spots, and yet Daniel knew that he needed to step toward that mirror, even if the reflection was uncomfortable, and even if the process made him feel fragile. As he sat at his small kitchen table eating toast, he opened his notebook again and wrote a new sentence. "Today, I will face myself," and those 5 words made him pause, because they felt heavier than the words he had written before, heavier but truer. And he whispered them again softly, letting their meaning move through him like a slow wave. After breakfast, Daniel put on a hoodie and stepped outside into the rain, letting the cool drops fall on his face as he walked down the street toward the park, because the rain always made him feel more connected to his emotions, as if the world slowed down enough for him to listen to himself without distractions. And as he walked, he thought about how many times he had ignored his emotions in the past, telling himself that it wasn't the right time to feel sad, or angry, or overwhelmed. And he realized how many times he had forced himself to be fine when he wasn't, and how that habit had slowly created a deep distance inside him, a distance between his true feelings and the face he showed the world, and this thought made him swallow slowly. Not with pain, but with understanding, because emotional intelligence requires honesty, and honesty begins with admitting the truth to yourself. When he arrived at the park, he found a quiet spot under a large tree, the rain falling softly onto the leaves above him, creating a gentle music that made him feel safe, and he sat down on the wet bench without caring that his clothes were getting damp, because he felt like this moment needed to happen exactly as it was, without comfort, without protection. He closed his eyes, took a long breath, and asked himself the question he had been avoiding for many years. What am I afraid to feel? And as soon as he asked it, he felt a small tightening in his chest, like a string being pulled gently, and at first, there was silence inside him, no words, no answers, only a soft heaviness. But as he breathed slowly, the answers rose to the surface one by one, fragile but clear. I am afraid to feel lonely. I am afraid to feel weak. I am afraid to feel rejected. I am afraid to feel like I'm not enough. And as these words formed in his mind, He felt a warm sting behind his eyes, not sadness exactly, but the tenderness of truth, the kind of truth that sits quietly in the heart until someone finally looks at it. Daniel didn't open his eyes. He let the feelings move through him naturally, not pushing them away, not analyzing them, simply allowing them to exist, and for the first time in his adult life, he let himself experience his emotions without resisting them. After a few minutes, he opened his notebook and wrote each feeling down on the page, his handwriting slow and thoughtful, and as he looked at the words, they seemed less frightening, less powerful, as if naming them pulled them out of the shadows and into the light. As the rain softened, Daniel stood up and began walking along the narrow path that wound through the trees, and with each step, he felt more connected to himself, more awake to the reality of his inner world. And he realized that emotional intelligence is not about controlling emotions, it is about understanding them, respecting them, listening to them, and giving them a place instead of pretending they don't exist. And while he walked, he remembered a moment from a few years ago when someone had told him he was too quiet, and he had laughed it off, pretending it didn't bother him. But now, as he looked inward with more honesty, he realized that the comment had hurt him deeply, not because there was something wrong with being quiet, but because he felt misunderstood, unseen, and judged for something that was simply part of who he was. And he realized how many times he had buried that feeling under a polite smile, how many times he had hidden behind silence, not because he wanted to be invisible, but because he didn't know how to face the emotions that came with being misunderstood. As he continued walking, Daniel approached a wooden bridge that crossed over a shallow stream, and he stopped in the middle of it, leaning on the railing as he watched the water move gently beneath him, and he thought about how emotions are like water, sometimes quiet, sometimes fast, sometimes muddy, sometimes clear, always moving, always changing, never staying in one place for long, and he felt comforted by this thought, because it reminded him that no feeling is permanent and no emotion is wrong. They all have a purpose, a message, a meaning, and he realized that his fear of emotions came from years of believing that feeling something deeply made him weak. But now he understood that avoiding emotions was what made him feel weak, and facing them made him stronger in ways he had never imagined. After standing on the bridge for a long time, Daniel walked toward the far side of the park where there was a small hill overlooking the city, and he climbed to the top slowly, feeling the wet grass under his shoes, and when he reached the top, he sat down on a large flat rock and looked at the quiet buildings in the distance, their colors soft and muted in the rain, and he felt a peaceful heaviness in his chest, the kind of heaviness that comes after telling the truth, and he whispered to himself, "I am learning who I really am," and those words felt like opening a window inside his mind, letting in fresh air and new possibilities. While he sat there, Daniel began thinking about the people in his life, his friends, his coworkers, his family, and he realized that he had been communicating with them through a filter, a barrier built from years of hiding his true feelings. And he thought about how many conversations had felt empty because he wasn't fully present, how many misunderstandings happened because he wasn't honest with himself, how many quiet frustrations grew inside him because he didn't know how to express what he truly felt, and he felt a mixture of sadness and hope, sadness for the moments lost, hope for the moments still waiting. As the rain slowly faded into a light mist, Daniel stood up again and walked toward the center of the park, passing by people with umbrellas and raincoats, and he noticed how the world seemed softer after rain, as if the sky had washed away a layer of noise. And he felt that something similar was happening inside him, as if his honesty had washed away a layer of emotional fog, making everything clearer, sharper, more real. When he reached the fountain near the entrance of the park, he sat down on a bench and watched the water rise and fall, and he thought about how emotional intelligence is not only about knowing what you feel, but also why you feel it. And as he reflected on the emotions he had written in his notebook, he realized that many of them came from old experiences, moments of rejection, moments of silence, moments when he felt invisible. And he understood that those old wounds still shaped his reactions today, and this realization made him breathe deeply, not with sadness, but with acceptance, because now he knew where to begin healing. A few minutes later, an elderly woman sat down beside him on the bench, and she looked at him with a gentle smile and said, "Wet day, isn't it?" And Daniel nodded and smiled back, and for a moment they sat quietly, watching the fountain together. And then she said softly, "Rain always makes me think," and Daniel nodded again, feeling the truth of her words, and he found himself saying, "It makes me think too," and she turned her head toward him and asked, "What about?" And normally Daniel would have given a quick, simple answer, but today he wanted to be honest, so he said quietly, "About myself, about my emotions, about understanding them better," and the woman smiled kindly and said, "That's brave. Most people run from themselves," and her words struck something deep inside him, because he knew they were true, and hearing a stranger say them out loud made him feel understood in a way he couldn't explain. They talked for a few minutes about life, about feelings, about how people often hide their emotions because they fear being judged, and the woman said something Daniel would never forget. When you understand your emotions, you don't lose control. You gain direction, and he felt those words land inside him like a seed waiting to grow. When Daniel finally walked home, the clouds had begun to break apart, revealing a gentle light behind them, and as he entered his apartment, he felt tired but deeply calm, like someone who had walked a long distance inside himself. And he sat at his desk again, opened his notebook, and wrote slowly, "I faced myself today," and as he looked at those words, he felt a new strength inside him, not loud, not flashy, but steady, grounded, real. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself to breathe slowly, letting the lessons of the day settle inside him like soft dust floating to the ground, and he whispered gently, "This is the beginning of understanding," and with that quiet truth, he felt ready for whatever would come next on this journey. The next morning arrived with sunlight filling Daniel's room in long, warm stripes, and as he opened his eyes, he felt lighter than he had in many days, not because his problems were gone, and not because he suddenly understood everything about himself, but because he had taken the brave step of facing his emotions honestly yesterday, and that simple courage still lived inside him like a steady flame, warm and gentle, guiding him forward. And as he sat up in bed stretching his arms slowly, he realized something important. Emotional intelligence was not only about looking inward, it was also about turning outward, about understanding the hearts of others the way he was beginning to understand his own. And he felt a quiet excitement in his chest, because he knew this next part of the journey would help him connect with people in ways he had never experienced before. After getting dressed, he made himself a soft cup of tea and sat by the window, watching people walk down the street below, and he thought about how every person carried invisible feelings, invisible fears, invisible dreams. And he wondered how many misunderstandings in the world happened simply because people didn't know how to see each other clearly, and he whispered gently to himself, "Today, I will try to understand others," and those words felt like opening a new door inside him, a door that led toward deeper connection. When he stepped outside, the air was fresh and cool after yesterday's rain, and the city seemed to breathe with a calmer rhythm, and as Daniel walked toward the park again, he noticed something different in the way he moved, as if he was paying attention not only to himself, but also to the world around him, and this awareness felt like a quiet superpower, something soft but powerful, something that made him feel more alive. As he reached the park, he saw a man sitting alone on a bench with his head in his hands, and for a moment Daniel hesitated. unsure if he should approach, unsure if he would be intruding. But then he reminded himself that emotional intelligence was not only about speaking, it was about sensing, noticing, respecting emotions without pushing or rushing, and so instead of approaching directly, Daniel simply walked by slowly, observing the man gently, and he noticed the man's shoulders shaking slightly and his breath uneven, and even though Daniel didn't know the man's story, he felt a soft ache of empathy rise inside him, because he knew what it felt like to hold heavy emotions alone, and as he walked further down the path, he whispered softly, "Everyone carries something," and this simple truth made him feel more connected to the people around him. As he continued through the park, he saw a young woman sitting on a bench reading a book, and her face was relaxed and calm, her shoulders loose, her breath steady, and Daniel realized that emotional intelligence also meant noticing positive emotions. The gentle joy of a quiet moment, the peace of being lost in a book, the soft happiness that appears without reason, and he felt a warm gratitude for these small, beautiful human experiences. A little further ahead, he saw a boy around 10 years old throwing a small ball into the air again, and each time he caught it, he smiled proudly, and each time he dropped it, he sighed dramatically and laughed, and Daniel felt a slow smile spread across his own face. Because the boy's emotions were open, free, unfiltered, and Daniel realized how children express their feelings naturally before the world teaches them to hide, and he thought about how emotional intelligence is not something we invent as adults. It's something we return to, something we remember, something we uncover beneath layers of fear and habit. After walking for a while, Daniel found a quiet bench near a row of tall trees, and he sat down, taking out his notebook, and he wrote a question at the top of the page. How can I understand people better and without thinking too hard? He wrote the first ideas that came to his mind. Listen more. Watch more. Ask gently. Don't assume. Don't rush. Don't judge. And when he read these words again, he felt a calm, steady confidence growing inside him, because these simple principles felt true, and they felt like seeds that could grow into something beautiful if he practiced them consistently. As he closed his notebook, he heard footsteps approaching, and when he looked up, he saw someone familiar. It was Mr. Hanley, the bookstore owner, walking slowly along the path with a small umbrella in his hand even though it wasn't raining. And Daniel felt a warm, friendly feeling in his chest as the older man smiled and approached the bench. "Morning, Daniel," he said in his gentle voice, and Daniel smiled back and offered him a seat, and the two of them sat quietly for a moment, watching the trees sway slightly in the soft breeze, and Daniel could sense something in Mr. Hanley's posture. A quiet heaviness, not as strong as yesterday but still present, and he remembered the conversation they had about the old man's daughter moving away. Trying to practice emotional intelligence, Daniel turned to him and said softly, "How are you feeling today?" And he asked it with genuine care, not politeness, not habit. Mr. Hanley breathed out slowly and said, "A little better today, thank you," and Daniel nodded, listening, and then the old man added, "Still getting used to an empty house, but I'm managing." Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it exist, because silence can be a gentle space where people gather their thoughts, and after a moment, he said softly, "It sounds like you're adjusting slowly," and Mr. Hanley nodded with a small smile, appreciating the understanding. Then the old man said something that made Daniel pause. "You know, Daniel, most people ask, 'How are you?' but they don't really want to know the answer. But you actually listen." And hearing these words, Daniel felt something warm bloom in his chest, because it meant that his efforts to understand others were real, visible, meaningful, and he realized that emotional intelligence is not about saying perfect things. It's about being present with someone's emotions, without judgment, without hurry, without pretending. After talking for a few minutes, Mr. Hanley thanked Daniel and continued his walk, and Daniel sat on the bench feeling a sense of quiet pride, not the loud kind that makes the heart race, but the soft kind that makes the heart expand slowly. Because he knew he was growing, he knew he was becoming more aware, more empathetic, more open. As he sat there reflecting, Daniel noticed a small dog running joyfully across the field chasing a ball, and a young man calling after it, laughing loudly, and something about the joy in that moment made Daniel feel lighter. Because he realized that understanding others isn't only about recognizing sadness or stress or fear, it's also about noticing joy, celebrating joy, appreciating joy when it appears in someone's face or voice. And this thought made him smile gently as he stood up and continued walking. As he walked toward the far side of the park, he saw a woman sitting alone staring at her phone with a worried expression, and Daniel felt a natural curiosity rising inside him, not intrusive curiosity, but empathetic curiosity. The kind that wonders what emotion hides behind the furrowed eyebrows and tense lips, and he imagined that maybe she had received difficult news, or maybe she was waiting for a message, or maybe she was lost in a worry that had followed her for days, and this simple imagination made Daniel feel closer to her even though they were strangers, because emotional intelligence allows you to see people as human, not as shapes passing by. After observing her for a moment, he continued walking until he reached a small pond on the far edge of the park where ducks swam lazily across the water, and he sat on a stone by the edge, letting the peaceful scene wash over him. And he thought about how emotional signals are everywhere, on faces, in body language, in the way someone walks, in the way someone sits, even in the silence between words, and he realized that the more he practiced noticing these signals, the more natural it would become, like learning a new language of the heart. While he sat there, he heard a voice behind him, a familiar voice, and when he turned around, he saw the woman from the cafe, the one who had dropped her phone days ago, smiling as she approached him. "Hi," she said warmly, and Daniel smiled back, surprised but happy, and she said, "I saw you sitting here and thought I'd say hello," and Daniel nodded and gestured for her to sit. They talked for a few minutes, first about simple things like the weather and the ducks in the pond, but then she mentioned that she was new to the city and still trying to adjust to the change, and Daniel listened carefully, noticing the small sadness in her voice even though she tried to speak lightly, and he asked gently, "Is the transition hard?" And she paused, surprised by the question, then nodded, admitting yes, a little. "It's strange being in a new place without knowing anyone." And Daniel felt that soft empathy again, the quiet connection, and he said, "That makes sense. Anyone would feel that way," and she looked at him with a grateful expression, as if those simple words made her feel understood instead of weak. They talked for a while longer, sharing small stories, small fears, small hopes, and Daniel realized that understanding others created a bridge between hearts, even between strangers, and when the conversation ended and she stood up to leave, she said softly, "Thank you for listening," and Daniel felt his heart warm again, because he knew she meant it, and he knew he had made a real connection, one that came not from knowing the right words, but from listening with sincerity. After she left, Daniel sat by the pond for a long time, letting the quiet water reflect the quiet growth inside him, and he whispered gently, "Understanding others begins with slowing down." And the truth of those words settled inside him like a soft stone dropping into still water. When Daniel finally walked home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden lines across the sky, and everything felt peaceful, gentle, balanced, and as he entered his apartment, he felt the same warm sense of calm that had greeted him the day before. But now it was stronger, clearer, deeper, because he was learning not only how to understand himself, but also how to understand the emotional world of others, and he knew this was only the beginning. He sat at his desk, opened his notebook quietly, and wrote, "Understanding others is a gift and a practice," and as he closed the notebook, he felt that quiet strength again, the kind that comes from growth, from awareness, from connection. And he whispered to himself, "I am learning to see people," and those soft words carried him into the gentle calm of the evening. The next morning came quietly, with a soft golden light resting on Daniel's pillow, and as he opened his eyes, he felt a mixture of calm and tension inside him, because over the last few days he had looked inward, he had understood others, he had listened. He had noticed, he had connected, but there was still one part of emotional intelligence he had not faced yet, the part that many people fear, the part that makes the heart beat fast and the stomach feel tight, the part that brings conflict and truth into the same room, and that part was the art of difficult conversations, the moments when you cannot stay silent, the moments when honesty becomes the bridge between misunderstanding and clarity. And as he sat up in bed, he felt a quiet nervousness rise inside him, because he knew that today, without planning it, without choosing it, he would face a conversation he had been avoiding for months, a conversation with someone he cared about, but also someone he had grown distant from, someone he had misunderstood, someone whose emotions he had misread again and again, and he felt his chest tighten slightly at the thought, but he reminded himself that growth does not happen only in comfort. It happens in truth, in vulnerability, in courage, and he whispered quietly to himself, "I will listen. I will speak. I will not run." After getting dressed, Daniel walked slowly to the kitchen, thinking about the person he needed to talk to, his friend Mark, a friend he had known for years, a friend he trusted, but also someone he had drifted away from because of an argument months ago. An argument that still lived quietly in the shadows of Daniel's memory, an argument that had never been resolved, and the distance between them had grown wider with each week of silence. As he made his tea, Daniel remembered how that argument had started over something small, something unimportant, something about planning a trip, but the emotion behind the argument had been deep. Mark had felt ignored. Daniel had felt misunderstood. And instead of expressing their real feelings, they had both spoken quickly, defensively, letting frustration shape their words instead of calmness, and when the argument ended, they walked away, each believing the other did not care. Daniel took a slow breath, remembering the look on Mark's face at the end, a mixture of disappointment and confusion, and he realized now that he had misread that expression back then. He had thought Mark was angry, but maybe he had been hurt. Maybe he had been lonely, maybe he had been asking for understanding in a clumsy way, and Daniel felt a small ache in his chest as he realized how easily emotions can be misunderstood when people do not slow down enough to listen. When he stepped outside into the warm morning air, he walked with a steady but thoughtful pace, heading toward the small cafe where he and Mark often met, and as he walked, he felt his heart beating faster, not with fear but with anticipation. Because he knew that emotional intelligence was not just about noticing gentle emotions, it was also about facing strong ones, heavy ones, complicated ones. As he walked down the familiar streets, he practiced the things he had learned, breathing softly, staying present, preparing to listen without interrupting, preparing to speak without blaming, preparing to understand without judging. And he reminded himself that difficult conversations are not battles. They are bridges, bridges built slowly with honesty and empathy. When he reached the cafe, he paused at the entrance, took one slow breath, and stepped inside. The warm smell of coffee wrapped around him, and soft music played in the background. Daniel looked around the room and saw Mark sitting at a small table near the window, his posture a little tense, his eyes lowered toward his phone, and Daniel felt a wave of emotion rise inside him: nostalgia, guilt, hope, and he walked slowly toward the table. Mark looked up when he saw Daniel, and for a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, each unsure how to begin, each feeling the quiet weight of the months between them, and Daniel felt his hands grow slightly warm. But he pulled out the chair and sat down gently, and Mark gave a small, polite smile, the kind that hides more emotion than it shows. After a few seconds of silence, Daniel spoke first, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, and Mark nodded and said, "Yeah, of course." Another silence fell between them, but this time Daniel did not rush to fill it. He let it exist, because silence can be a doorway, and eventually, Mark breathed out slowly and said, "I wasn't sure if we were going to talk again." And those words hit Daniel deep in the chest, not as a wound but as truth, honest truth, and he felt grateful that Mark had said them instead of hiding behind small talk. Daniel leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt like a weight lifting from his tongue. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I didn't talk to you after the argument. I didn't understand how you felt, and I didn't understand how I felt either." Mark looked at him carefully, his expression shifting slowly, softening a little, and he said quietly, "I wasn't angry that day, Daniel. I was hurt. I felt like you didn't want me there. It made me feel unimportant." And hearing these words, Daniel felt something deep inside him open, because this was the part of the story he had never understood, the part hidden behind Mark's frustrated tone during the argument, the part he had misread as anger. And he felt a wave of empathy wash over him, gentle but strong. "I didn't know," Daniel said quietly. "I thought you were upset with me. I thought I disappointed you." Mark shook his head slowly. "I just wanted you to tell me what you needed. I just wanted us to understand each other." For a moment, they both sat there, absorbing the truth they had avoided for months, and Daniel realized that this moment was not about old mistakes, it was about new understanding. And so he spoke with the softness he had learned over the last few days. "I'm trying to understand emotions better," he said. "I'm trying to learn how to listen, how to talk honestly. I didn't know how to do that before." Mark nodded slowly, looking down at his hands and then back at Daniel. "I can tell," he said softly. "You sound different." Daniel felt a small smile inside him, not on his face, but in his heart, because hearing that meant something was changing, something was healing. They talked for a long time, longer than they had expected, sharing the emotions behind the argument, sharing the fears, the misunderstandings, the quiet pain they had carried separately, and the more they talked, the more the tension between them softened, like ice melting in slow sunlight. There was a moment during their conversation when Mark paused and said, "I thought maybe you didn't care anymore," and Daniel shook his head immediately, his voice calm but heartfelt. "No," he said. "I cared so much that it scared me. And when I'm scared, I go quiet. I hide. I'm learning not to do that anymore." And in that moment, Mark's eyes softened completely, and he said, "Thank you for telling me." And Daniel realized that honesty, even when imperfect, even when shaky, is one of the strongest forms of emotional intelligence. As the conversation continued, they began to laugh softly at small memories, old moments, inside jokes, and little by little, the distance between them shrank, replaced by understanding, forgiveness, and warmth. When they finally left the cafe, the sunlight outside felt brighter than before, and Daniel felt lighter in his chest, as if a quiet stone had lifted from his heart. Mark walked with him for a few minutes down the street, and there was a new gentleness in the space between them, a new clarity, and before they went separate ways, Mark said, "I'm glad we talked," and Daniel smiled genuinely, saying, "Me too." As he walked home alone, Daniel felt a deep, steady pride building inside him, because he had done something brave today, something he had been afraid of for a long time, something many people avoid for years. He had walked into a difficult conversation with openness, honesty, and empathy, and he had come out stronger, more connected, more peaceful. When Daniel reached his apartment, he sat at his desk, opened his notebook slowly, and wrote, "Difficult conversations are places where hearts learn to breathe," and when he read the sentence again, he felt a warm, gentle truth move through him. Because he knew now that emotional intelligence was not only about peaceful moments in the park or quiet reflections in the rain, it was also about stepping into uncomfortable spaces with courage, about listening when your instinct is to defend, about speaking when your instinct is to hide, about meeting another person in the quiet middle of misunderstanding and choosing to build a bridge instead of a wall. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and let out a slow breath, feeling both exhausted and proud, and he whispered softly, "I can do hard things," and the strength in those words stayed with him long into the evening. The next morning rose gently, with soft light touching the edges of Daniel's curtains and moving across the room like a quiet invitation, and as he opened his eyes, he felt something different inside him, something calm and warm, something steady. As if the world inside and around him had become softer, clearer, and more connected, and as he lay there for a moment listening to the distant sound of birds and the peaceful silence between each sound, he realized that he was not the same person he had been just a few days ago, because emotional intelligence had slowly reshaped the way he breathed, the way he listened, the way he understood himself, and the way he understood others. When he finally sat up, he felt no rush, no pressure, no tightness in his chest. Instead, he felt a peaceful confidence, like a gentle strength resting quietly in his heart, and he whispered softly to himself, "I am learning to see differently." And those words felt like the beginning of a new chapter in his life, rather than the end of one. After a few moments of breathing calmly in the warm morning light, he stood up, got dressed, and walked to his small kitchen, thinking about everything that had changed, not in dramatic ways, but in small, quiet ways, in gentle discoveries, in slow realizations, in silent moments when he finally allowed his emotions to speak instead of pushing them aside. And he felt grateful for every step of the journey, even the uncomfortable ones, even the moments that had made him nervous or uncertain. Because he now understood that growth often hides inside discomfort, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to look inward. He made himself a warm cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the people walking down the street below, and as he observed their movements, their postures, the expressions on their faces, he felt a deep connection to them. Not because he knew their stories, but because he understood something important. Every person lives with emotions. Every person carries fears and hopes. Every person feels joy, sadness, confusion, excitement, frustration, and love. And emotional intelligence is the light that helps us see those invisible experiences more clearly. He noticed a woman carrying a small child, the child laughing and reaching for her hair, and the mother smiling in a tired but loving way, and he felt the warmth of that moment as if it were his own. He noticed an older man walking slowly, stopping every few steps as if he were lost in memories or thoughts too heavy to rush through, and Daniel felt a soft empathy fill his chest, reminding him of Mr. Hanley. And then he noticed a young couple talking quietly, their shoulders close, their voices low, and though he could not hear their words, He understood something simply by watching the gentle movement of their faces. They were trying to understand each other, trying to listen, trying to connect, and Daniel felt grateful to recognize that effort, because only a few days ago, he might not have noticed at all. After watching for a while, Daniel stepped outside and walked slowly through the familiar streets, feeling the quiet morning air on his skin, feeling his emotions settle gently inside him, feeling his thoughts float freely without tension. And every step he took felt like a continuation of the journey he had begun the moment he decided to pay attention to his inner world. When he reached the park, he paused for a moment at the entrance, remembering all the moments he had experienced there over the last few days, the confusion, the reflection, the calmness, the realizations. And he felt a wave of gratitude wash through him as he walked inside. The trees swayed softly in the breeze, their leaves whispering a quiet song that felt like encouragement, like support, and Daniel walked the familiar path with slow, thoughtful steps, noticing the small details around him, the sound of footsteps on the gravel, the distant laughter of someone on the other side of the park, the gentle rustling of a bird landing on a branch above him, and he realized how much more alive the world felt now that he was paying attention. He sat on his usual bench, the one beside the row of tall trees, and he let his eyes wander over the open field in front of him, breathing slowly and deeply, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely present. He thought about the journey he had taken, the emotional honesty he had faced, the people he had connected with, the difficult conversation he had survived, the empathy he had practiced, the understanding he had gained, and he felt proud of himself. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a soft, steady way, like someone who had finally learned how to hear their own heart clearly. As he sat there, he remembered the young woman he had met by the pond, the cafe moments, the boy throwing the ball, the stranger on the bench with his head in his hands, and he realized that emotional intelligence was not a skill he used only sometimes. It was becoming a lens through which he saw the world, a gentle filter that softened judgments, strengthened understanding, and made room for compassion. After a while, Daniel noticed an older woman sitting quietly on a nearby bench, holding a small notebook in her lap, and she seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant but peaceful, and for a moment he felt a natural curiosity rise inside him, wondering what memories or ideas filled her notebook, wondering what emotions she carried, wondering what stories she had lived, and he felt a deep respect for the private world each person holds within them. He thought about how emotional intelligence invites us to imagine the unseen, to approach others with gentleness, to accept that everyone is fighting a quiet battle or holding a quiet hope, and he felt a quiet responsibility inside him, a responsibility to move through life with understanding rather than assumption. He looked back at the trees, their branches stretching into the open sky, and he felt that same sense of freedom, that same sense of expansion, the slow but steady opening of the heart that happens when someone learns to accept themselves completely. As he sat there, reflecting, he noticed footsteps approaching, and when he looked up, he saw the young woman from the pond walking toward him with a warm smile on her face, and Daniel felt a soft surprise, but also a calm happiness. She greeted him gently and sat beside him, and the two of them talked in a slow, easy rhythm, as if they had known each other longer than they had. She told him about her week, about the challenges of being new in the city, about a moment when she felt lonely, about a moment when she felt hopeful, and Daniel listened with quiet attention, feeling a clear understanding of her emotions. And he spoke softly, responding with empathy and honesty, and he began to realize that emotional intelligence had given him something precious, the ability to make people feel safe, understood, and valued simply by being present with them. After they talked for a while, she thanked him again for listening, and Daniel felt a warm glow in his chest as she walked away, because he knew that emotional intelligence had not only changed his inner world, it was changing the way others experienced him. He stood up from the bench and walked toward the far edge of the park, where the ground sloped gently downward toward a quiet field, and as he reached the open space, he felt the magnitude of everything he had learned rise softly inside him like a slow tide. He realized that emotional intelligence was not a destination. It was a practice, a daily choice, a gentle skill that grows with attention, patience, and courage. He realized that emotions were not enemies to fight or hide from. They were messages, signals, guides, and every time he listened to them, he understood himself more deeply. With the sun warm on his face, Daniel whispered softly, "I am learning to live with my heart open," and the words felt true, simple, and strong. He turned and walked slowly back through the park, feeling the world breathe around him, feeling the calm steadiness of his own breath, and he realized that the journey toward emotional intelligence had not ended, it had only begun. When he reached his apartment again, he sat at his desk, opened his notebook one final time, and wrote, "Emotional intelligence is the art of seeing with the heart," and as he closed the notebook, he felt a deep peace settle inside him. A peace that came from understanding himself, understanding others, and choosing every day to approach the world with empathy, clarity, and kindness. And as the evening light filled his room, Daniel felt ready for the future, ready for new conversations, new connections, new challenges, and new moments of understanding, because he now carried something he had never truly had before. The ability to speak with softness, to listen with patience, to feel with honesty, and to live with awareness. The journey had changed him, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, gently, and beautifully, and as he breathed in the quiet calm of the evening, he whispered the last words of his day, "This is only the beginning." And the truth of those words settled around him like the soft glow of sunset, warm, steady, and full of hope.